What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be talking about muzzle velocity in Modern Warfare and just how important this stat is. Now for those that don't know, muzzle velocity is often increased or decreased by a few of the muzzle attachments as well as many of the barrel attachments in the game. You don't see muzzle velocity outside of that. As far as I'm aware, there might be some weird exception, but generally speaking, it's muzzle or barrel attachments that affect your bullet velocity. And just in case you guys didn't know, in Modern Warfare, all of the guns are now projectile. They are not hit scans. So this means when you fire a gun, there is an actual bullet that comes out of the gun and connects to your target. Whereas in almost every previous Call of Duty game, with the exception of Black Ops 4, it used a hit scan system, which meant there was no actual projectile for standard guns. The game would just calculate whether you were on target or off target when your gun went off, and then decide if it was going to award you a hit. So what this means is with some guns, especially at longer ranges, you do actually have to lead your target a little bit. And if we're talking extremely long ranges, like on some of the ground war maps for instance, you may also have to compensate for bullet drops slightly. Although I will say in most situations, if you're using standard guns like assault rifles, SMGs, LMGs, generally speaking, bullet drop just doesn't factor into the equation. It's not something you have to worry about. It's mainly just for like sniper rifles or if you're really trying to stretch out and hit somebody at a super long range with a pistol. Now as for the different weapon classes, generally it seems the bullet velocity is actually tied to the caliber that you're using, although there are definitely exceptions here. And the big exception is pistols. For whatever reason in this game, the muzzle velocity on pistols doesn't appear to be even close to accurate to real life, whereas with the other guns in the game, you do get a little bit more accuracy when it comes to that. What I mean by this is your bullet velocity on pistols is extremely slow. It's basically like the speed of a paintball rather than a bullet. And this is one of the reasons that pistols can feel so inconsistent and it feels like your bullets are just going straight through people. And this is due to the fact that even at close ranges, you often have to be leading your target when you really wouldn't think that you should have to, because you're using a real gun, not a paintball gun, within like 10 meters, for instance. So when it comes to pistols, you do have to really be aware of bullet velocity because that can throw you off. And also it's worth mentioning that most of the SMGs, they will be a smaller caliber than the assault rifles, and therefore bullet velocity plays a bit more of a role than with the assault rifles. Also, obviously, range is a massive factor here. In close quarter situations, with most guns aside from pistols, muzzle velocity is essentially irrelevant. You won't notice a difference. It'll essentially feel like the game is a hit scan anyways, so it's not something you have to think about. It's mainly just when you start to stretch out like beyond 50 meters. But with all that out of the way, let's get into the testing that I did. And I am going to leave a link to the spreadsheet with the raw data in the description down below if you guys want to check all of this out, because there's a decent amount of data and I don't want to get too detailed with it. But basically with my tests, I did tests at various ranges. I did a test at 80 meters, 50 meters, 30 meters, and then point blank range. Then with each of the guns I tested the delay between firing and hitting my target with 5 shots at each of these ranges. And the reason I use 5 shots is there's a lot of variance with this. And this is most likely due to the processing delay in game, which I should also point out, I did this in a LAN environment. I didn't do this in an online custom game. This is on LAN, and that should eliminate any sort of potential network delay, which means any delay that you're seeing here is actually just down to the game processing that data. And there was a surprising amount of variance at the same range in the amount of time it takes for your shots to register. So just as an example, at point blank range, literally touching the other player, sometimes the shot will register in 33 milliseconds or 2 frames at 60 FPS, and other times it will be 67 milliseconds or 4 frames at 60 FPS. So sometimes it takes literally double the amount of time for that bullet to register with the same gun, the same attachments at the exact same range. And as far as I can tell, this is just down to that in-game processing. So this is something you really have to keep in mind as we go through the data here. And first off, let's have a look at the comparison between the different weapon classes. With the X16 pistol, at 80 meters, it took an average of 190 milliseconds for the shot to register. With the MP5, it was quite a bit faster at 87 milliseconds on average. And then finally, with the M4A1, it was just a little bit faster at 80 milliseconds. Which, if you account for the amount of variance you tend to see in bullet velocity, it's pretty much equal to the MP5. As for point blank range, it would take roughly 60 milliseconds on average for the pistol shot to register. For the MP5 shot, it would take about 46 milliseconds on average for that shot to register. And then finally for the M4A1 at point blank range, on average it would take 60 milliseconds for the shot to register. So again, you can just see there's such a wide variance there. The M4 should have a noticeably better bullet velocity, but at point blank range, you're seeing so much variance there compared to the MP5. What I take away from looking at the data here when looking at the different weapon class types is at longer ranges, you do see some clear trends, especially when you look at pistols versus like SMGs and assault rifles, but there's not that much of a difference between SMGs and assault rifles at longer ranges. Also, up close, it doesn't really seem to matter which gun you're using because muzzle velocity is essentially irrelevant. All that really matters here is the in-game processing delay. So next, I wanted to start to look at some of the attachments that can impact your bullet velocity. And first off, I want to look at the attachments that increase your bullet velocity. So these should be helping you in the bullet velocity category. With the X16, at longer ranges like 80 meters and 50 meters, we saw a roughly 50% increase to our bullet velocity, which is great, and that's definitely noticeable in those ranges. However, at 30 meters and point blank range, there is a negligible difference even when stacking all of the best bullet velocity increasing attachments that you can. So up close, it just doesn't seem to really matter. With the MP5 stacked up with the bullet velocity increasing attachments, it turns out there is a negligible difference at every range that I tested to your bullet velocity. So it doesn't really seem to make a difference to increase your bullet velocity with the MP5 using attachments, because it doesn't actually help a noticeable amount when you account for the variance that we see. As for the M4A1 with the M16 barrel, which does help with your bullet velocity, at 80 meters, we saw a really good improvement to your bullet velocity. It was connecting almost as if it was hit scan at this range. And on average, the bullet was connecting in 33 milliseconds, whereas without that attachment, it was 80 milliseconds. So it's definitely noticeable here with the M4A1 at longer ranges. But once again, once we got to the 30-meter range and the point-blank range, this didn't really seem to make a noticeable difference. So when it comes to increasing your bullet velocity using attachments, generally speaking, within 50 meters, which is going to be the vast majority of your gunfights in the standard modes like 6v6 as well as 10v10, there's really not much reason to worry about increasing your bullet velocity. However, at ranges longer than 50 meters, with assault rifles and pistols, it definitely seems to be worth it. However, with SMGs, it doesn't really seem to matter that much if you increase that bullet velocity. As for the other side of the equation, if you're putting attachments on that will decrease your bullet velocity, what effect will that have? Well, once again, at longer ranges with the X16 pistol, we did see a pretty noticeable change here. On average, the bullet will take roughly 40 to 45% longer to register beyond 50 meters. Also, at 30 meters, we're still seeing a noticeable reduction to your bullet velocity, which is the first time that we've seen that so far in the testings. So you definitely want to be careful about reducing your bullet velocity when it comes to pistols, because even at closer ranges, you will notice this. Not so much at point blank range, but even just 30 meters, there is a clear difference. As for the MP5 with a barrel that reduces your bullet velocity beyond 50 meters, the bullet was taking almost twice as long to register on target, which again is very noticeable within these ranges, and this does have a pretty big impact on your ability to hit people, especially when they're moving at longer ranges. However, when it comes to closer ranges, 30 meters or lower, there really wasn't a measurable change at all to your bullet velocity. And as a result, if you're playing to the strengths of an SMG, you don't have to worry about attachments that lower your bullet velocity. It's only when you start to stretch those ranges beyond the standard effective range of the SMG anyways, where bullet velocity starts to become an issue. So finally, with the M4A1 stacked up with all the attachments that you can that reduce your bullet velocity, at 50 to 80 meters, we saw a very slight slowdown with the bullet velocity. It took about 10 to 15% longer for that bullet to register, which is hardly noticeable. Most of the time, it actually registered on the same frame as if you didn't have the attachment on. It's just sometimes it would end up going a little bit slower. And then, of course, at closer ranges, there was no real measurable change when you account for the variance that we see in the processing. So as a result, when it comes to the M4, even at long ranges, I wouldn't really worry too much about lowering your bullet velocity. But as we saw earlier, it is a great idea to help increase your bullet velocity because that does have a very noticeable impact at longer ranges. So that pretty much covers it for all the testing that I did. I hope it wasn't too complicated. I tried to break it down and present it in the simplest way possible while still thoroughly covering the topic. But the basic conclusions I can draw for this video is, first off, there is always going to be a certain amount of variance in hitting your target due to processing delays anyways, and therefore, especially at closer ranges, the vast majority of ranges you'll find in 6v6 or 10v10 maps, bullet velocity is basically an irrelevant stat. You don't have to worry about attachments that decrease or increase bullet velocity if you're planning to play in standard ranges anyways. If, however, you are planning on stretching the range out beyond 50 meters, for instance, this is where you may want to put some focus on that bullet velocity stat. You want to stay away from those attachments that significantly lower your bullet velocity. And at least with assault rifles, pistols, and also sniper rifles, because you tend to use sniper rifles mainly in longer ranges, it's definitely a good idea to try to put some attachments on that will increase your bullet velocity, because this will make a noticeable difference at those very long ranges when it comes to hitting targets, especially if they're moving. And in the case of sniper rifles, you also notice bullet drop a lot more with the sniper rifles, and therefore increasing your bullet velocity will actually reduce the amount of bullet drop that you have to compensate for. And with that, we're going to be wrapping up today's video. I'd like to know in the comment section below, were you surprised by these results at all? And also, now that you know this information, will that have any effect on the attachment selection that you make in-game? Just let me know those thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.